The town of Evergloom was a place where wealth and poverty brushed shoulders daily, though neither seemed to truly see the other. The grand mansions perched on the hilltops gazed disdainfully over the cramped streets below, where merchants called out their wares and children played barefoot in the dust. Among the wealthiest of Evergloom's elite was Thaddeus Greer, a man as meticulous about his wealth as he was mistrustful of those around him. Thaddeus had not always been this way. Once, in his youth, he had been filled with dreams of building something great, of leaving behind a legacy that people would speak of for generations. But as the years passed and his fortunes grew, his dreams were replaced by paranoia. To him, every glance held envy, every smile hid deceit, and every outstretched hand was poised to take what he had earned. The only thing Thaddeus trusted was his money, and even that trust was fragile. He had a habit of checking his coin pouch at random intervals throughout the day, counting the gold pieces within as though they might sprout legs and wander off. So it was no surprise that on this particular evening, as he strolled through the bustling market square, he felt compelled to check once more. The square was alive with the hum of voices and the clatter of carts. Lanterns hung from poles, casting a warm glow over the cobblestones. Thaddeus walked with purpose, his heavy boots clicking against the stones. His velvet coat and polished cane made him stand out among the simple townsfolk, but he paid no mind to their curious glances. As he reached into his coat and pulled out the pouch, a frown creased his face. It felt lighter than he remembered. He opened it and quickly counted the coins. Sure enough, a few were missing. His chest tightened. He looked around the square, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, who might have taken them. And then he saw him. Sitting by the fountain was a man dressed in tattered clothes, his hair unkempt and his hands calloused. Lauren, as he was known, was a fixture of the town, a beggar who asked for nothing but played his wooden flute for those willing to spare a coin. At that moment, Lauren was bending down to pick up something from the ground, a small, glinting coin that had likely been dropped by a passerby. Thaddeus's heart raced. He clenched his fists, his mind jumping to conclusions faster than reason could catch up. That must be my coin, he thought. The beggar must have stolen it. He didn't confront Lauren then and there. Instead, he turned on his heel and marched back to his mansion, his thoughts spiraling into darker and darker places. He sat in his study, staring into the crackling fire, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. The image of Lauren picking up the coin became twisted and exaggerated, fueled by Thaddeus's growing paranoia. By the time the fire burned low, Thaddeus was convinced of Lauren's guilt. The thought of being taken advantage of being made a fool, was unbearable. The night deepened, and the streets of Evergloom grew quiet. But Thaddeus was not at rest. Driven by a need to reclaim what he believed was his, he grabbed a heavy walking stick and left his mansion. The town was cloaked in shadows as he made his way to the old chapel, where he knew Lauren often sought shelter. The air was cold, and the sound of Thaddeus's boots echoed against the stone walls. When he arrived, he saw Lauren asleep under the archway, his wooden flute clutched in his hands. The sight filled Thaddeus with a strange mix of anger and triumph. He raised his walking stick and banged it against the ground, startling Lauren awake. "You thought you could steal from me?" Thaddeus growled, his voice sharp and accusing. Lauren blinked up at him, confused and frightened. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't lie to me," Thaddeus shouted. "I saw you with my coin." Lauren shook his head, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I found a coin, yes, but it wasn't yours. I've never stolen anything in my life." But Thaddeus's mind was made up. He saw Lauren's words as nothing more than the desperate lies of a guilty man. His grip tightened on the walking stick, and before he could stop himself, he struck. The first blow knocked Lauren back, the flute tumbling from his hands. The second blow silenced his cries. And then there was nothing but the sound of the chapel bell ringing faintly in the distance. Thaddeus stood over Lauren's still form, his chest heaving. For a moment, he felt vindicated. Justice had been served, he told himself. But as the adrenaline began to fade, doubt crept in. He looked down at Lauren and saw not a thief, but a man who had lived a hard life, who had asked for so little and received even less. The flute lay broken beside him, a symbol of the only joy he had known. Thaddeus turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy with the weight of what he had done. The next morning, as the town awoke to the news of Lauren's death, Thaddeus sat in his study, staring at the coin pouch on his desk. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was the constable, holding a familiar pouch. "We found this near the tavern," the constable said, handing it over. "It must have fallen when you were leaving last night." Thaddeus's heart sank as he opened the pouch and counted the coins. Every single one was there. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. Lauren had been innocent. Thaddeus had killed an innocent man. As the constable left, Thaddeus sat in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He thought of Lauren's flute, of the music that would no longer grace the market square. He thought of the life he had taken and the trust he had broken, not in others but in himself. In the days that followed, Thaddeus tried to make amends. He turned the chapel into a sanctuary for the town's poor, a place where they could find warmth and shelter. He hung Lauren's flute on the wall as a reminder of his folly, a symbol of a man who had given so much with so little. But no matter what he did, Thaddeus could not escape the memory of that night. It haunted him, a constant reminder that wealth could not buy forgiveness, and suspicion could destroy more than it protected. The sanctuary brought a strange kind of solace to the people of Evergloom. It was as though the chapel, once solemn and cold, had come alive with purpose. The townsfolk whispered among themselves about Thaddeus Greer's sudden transformation. Some believed it was guilt, others thought it was penance, and a few simply called it madness. Thaddeus, however, cared little for what the townsfolk thought. Each day, he worked tirelessly to repair the chapel's worn walls and crumbling roof. He filled it with simple cots, warm blankets, and a large pot where stew simmered for anyone who needed a meal. But no matter how much he gave, the guilt weighed heavy on him, an invisible chain he could not break. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, Thaddeus found himself staring at the flute hanging on the wall. It was cracked and worn, but it still seemed to hold a faint trace of Lauren's spirit. He reached out and touched it gently, his fingers brushing against the smooth wood. A sudden memory washed over him, the soft, lilting melodies Lauren used to play in the square. Thaddeus had heard them 100 times, but he had never truly listened. Now, the silence where those songs had once been was deafening. Determined, he took the flute down from the wall and held it in his hands. He had never played an instrument before, but he brought it to his lips and tried to produce a sound. The first attempt was a harsh, discordant note, and he winced. He tried again, and then again, until a faint, trembling melody began to emerge. The sound drew the attention of a young girl who had been sitting in the corner of the chapel. Her name was Marin, one of the many children who sought refuge there. She watched Thaddeus with wide eyes, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. "Is that Lauren's flute?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thaddeus nodded, lowering the instrument. "It is," he said. Marin hesitated, then stepped closer. "He used to play for us. Every evening, just before the lanterns were lit. His music made the world feel softer." Thaddeus felt a lump in his throat. "I'm trying to honor him," he said, his voice rough. "But I fear I'll never play as he did." The girl studied him for a moment, then reached out her small hand. "May I try?" Surprised, Thaddeus handed her the flute. Marin brought it to her lips and played a simple tune, soft and uneven, but filled with a kind of innocence that reminded Thaddeus of Lauren's gentle nature. The sound filled the chapel, and others began to gather, drawn by the melody. It wasn't long before laughter and chatter replaced the usual quiet, and the space felt alive in a way it hadn't before. That night, Thaddeus made a decision. He would learn to play the flute, not just for himself, but for the people Lauren had left behind. Every evening, as the lanterns were lit in the square, he would sit in the chapel and play. At first, the notes were clumsy, but as the weeks passed, the melodies grew richer and more confident. The townsfolk began to talk about the music that drifted from the chapel each night. It became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, beauty could still emerge. Children gathered to listen, their laughter filling the air, while the elderly closed their eyes and let the music carry them to a place where their burdens felt lighter. For Thaddeus, the act of playing became more than just penance. It was a way to connect with a part of himself he had long buried, a part that yearned for connection, for community, for redemption. One evening, as he played a particularly haunting melody, an old man approached the chapel door. He was stooped with age, his face lined with years of hardship. Thaddeus recognized him as one of Lauren's few friends, a man who had often sat with the beggar in the square. The old man listened for a moment, then stepped inside. "You play well," he said, his voice rough but kind. "But do you understand the stories behind the songs?" Thaddeus lowered the flute, puzzled. "Stories?" The old man nodded. Lauren's music wasn't just music. Each tune carried a piece of his life, his struggles, his dreams. He played not for coins, but for the memories he couldn't put into words. Thaddeus felt a chill run down his spine. "I didn't know," he admitted. The old man smiled faintly. "Few did. But if you truly wish to honor him, play with your heart, not just your hands. Let the music speak for itself." From that night on, Thaddeus approached the flute differently. He stopped trying to perfect the notes and instead let the music flow freely, guided by his emotions. The melodies became richer, more poignant, as though they carried the weight of all he had learned and lost. In time, the people of Evergloom came to see Thaddeus not as the cold and distant millionaire he had once been, but as a man who had found a way to give back. The sanctuary flourished, and the chapel became a symbol of hope and healing for the town. But Thaddeus never forgot the night that had changed his life. Every time he played, he thought of Lauren, of the man who had given so much with so little, and of the lessons he had left behind. And though the guilt never fully faded, it became a part of the music, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could lead to something beautiful. As the years passed, the sanctuary in the old chapel grew into more than just a refuge. It became the heart of Evergloom, a place where laughter echoed, songs were shared, and lives intertwined. The townsfolk often remarked on how the once distant Thaddeus Greer had become a man transformed, his wealth now a tool for building bridges rather than walls. But Thaddeus knew his journey was not about redemption in the eyes of others. It was about facing himself, about making peace with the man he had been and finding a way to honor the life he had taken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the town in hues of gold and purple, Thaddeus decided it was time. He carefully took Lauren's flute down from its place on the wall, now repaired and polished but still bearing the marks of its history. He held it in his hands, feeling its weight, not just as an instrument, but as a symbol of everything he had learned. The chapel was full that night, as word had spread that Thaddeus would be performing one final time. Families gathered, children sat cross-legged on the floor, and the elderly claimed the best spots near the front. Even those who had never set foot in the sanctuary came, drawn by the promise of something meaningful. Thaddeus stood before them, his once proud posture now softened with age and humility. He raised the flute to his lips and began to play. The first notes were light and tentative, like a memory stirring awake. Then the melody deepened, rich with sorrow and hope, joy and regret. It was a song unlike any other he had played before, a tapestry of emotions woven together, telling the story of a man who had lost his way and found it again through the kindness he had once overlooked. As the music filled the air, the townsfolk closed their eyes and let it wash over them. Some wept quietly, while others smiled, their hearts lifted by the beauty of the moment. When the final note lingered and faded, the chapel was silent. Then, slowly, the silence gave way to applause, not the polite clapping of a crowd, but the heartfelt expression of gratitude from a community that had been changed, just as Thaddeus had been. Thaddeus lowered the flute and looked out at the faces before him. "This song," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "is not mine. It belongs to Lauren, to all of you, and to the hope that we can always do better, no matter how far we've strayed." The applause grew louder, but Thaddeus only smiled softly and placed the flute back in its place on the wall. It had served its purpose, and now it would rest, a reminder of the power of change, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the days that followed, Thaddeus stepped back from the sanctuary, entrusting its care to the townsfolk who had come to cherish it. He spent his remaining years quietly, tending to small gardens, helping where he could, and living a life of quiet gratitude. When Thaddeus passed away, the chapel bell rang out in his honor. The townsfolk gathered, lighting candles and playing soft melodies on flutes they had learned to make and play, inspired by Lauren and Thaddeus. And though the man himself was gone, his legacy endured in the music, the sanctuary, and the hearts of those who had come to understand the power of kindness, forgiveness, and change. In Evergloom, it was said that on quiet nights, if you listened closely near the chapel, you could still hear the faint notes of a flute, carried on the wind, a melody of redemption, echoing through the town and beyond.